It's my great pleasure that on the third day of the first NOvation online forum, I can introduce Lee Vinsel as a keynote speaker. Lee Vinsel is Assistant Professor for Science, Technology, and Society at Virginia Tech. My searching on him on the internet gave me that he's a historian of technology who feels at home in the field of STS, and he's recently written a book about automobile regulation in the US from a historical perspective. But we're also very happy to have him here because of another book he's recently published about critical take on the pro-innovation bias, the innovation delusion. And in his work, he criticizes the pro-innovation bias, and he emphasizes repair. And so he's also co-organizing the Maintainers, an international research network on people interested in maintenance, which is also a topic that I'm very interested in. So I think that's just great to have you here, because I think it's not only innovation studies that focus very much on innovation, but also people have pointed out that STS, the field in which a lot of people from our side are, that also has an innovation bias. You know, we tend to look at innovation a lot more than we look at repair and maintenance. So I think that's very, very nice that you're also working on this to shed more light on these unreflected parts of modern societies that also come with innovation. So I'm very happy that you're here. I won't have any more introductory remarks. Just the title of the presentation is Towards a Materialist History of Innovation, Thinking with and Beyond Benoît Godin, which we're also very happy to have that theme. And I think it's a very fitting and nice closing keynote of our first forum of NOvation. So, Lee, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Cornelius. And thanks everybody for having me here. You can see my slide, okay, right? And hear me? Thumbs up.
Everything's good.
Thank you. Awesome. So it's great to be here for all kinds of reasons. I'm glad to talk about this topic, but also I just really think NOvation is important. And it's a project I really believe in. I think that for a long time, I think we need kind of a hub of what we might call like critical innovation studies. I believe that for years now, and I think NOvation can do some of that important work. So today I want to talk about use some time to reflect on Benoît, who was such a important person in getting NOvation and lots of our works on these topics going. And I realized that, there's already been obituaries and memorial services, but I haven't had the occasion to work through my relationship to Benoît for myself, let alone for anyone else. And I believe that his work is truly foundational for the study of the concept of innovation and innovation more generally. And, I think we're going to be citing Benoît for years and years. Anyone who studies innovation going forward is absolutely going to be citing his work because it's just totally foundational. I also want to talk about why, some reasons why my co-author, Andy Russell, and I ended up taking a kind of different path than the one Benoît laid out, and others, I think, have followed. Though our approach is one that draws heavily on Benoît's early pathbreaking and surveying work, not just early, but up to the point where he left us. And I specifically want to talk about how Andy Russell and I ended up focusing on the distinction we make between actual innovation and innovation speak that you'll find in the book, The Innovation Delusion, and this distinction between innovation and actual innovation speak is also now playing a big role in my new book project, which examines the American economy from the 1970s to the present, and is focused on technology, globalization, policymaking, and especially work. The key theme is work, and the working title, it's kind of a playful working title, is called A Good History of shit jobs. And I think that, this is like one of those titles that I came up with on the fly because I knew kind of what I wanted to talk with, but then I regretted it as soon as, when I got locked into it. So I want to give a couple caveats about what I mean here. The first is that when I say beyond Benoît, I really mean beyond what I was able to talk with him about, because he and I had conversations about some of these topics, but it's just not it's not something we were able to kind of like fully work out ever, even though we had chats about it. And I really wish I had more time with him. And this is one of the tragedies of losing colleagues and friends, of course, is all those conversations you want to have. So it's not necessarily about improvement, it's about difference and this kind of lack of conversation. The second is that, there's this is like towards something or other, is like some formula that exists and has existed for a long time. And I really maybe more accurately mean like, a road back to materialist studies of innovation. Benoît was very sensitive to and critical of putting old wine in new bottles. You can see this in his, his central history of the concept of innovation, when he kind of takes the economist Christopher Freeman to task for inventing innovation studies, but totally ignoring all the stuff that came before him. And I also sat next to him at a conference where there was someone giving a talk up front, and he turned to me at one point and he goes, "Is there anything new at this, in this kind of very sarcastic and a little bit angry tone that he could have sometimes." And the answer was, despite the rhetoric of the person up there was nothing new. So I think Benoît was really, sensitive about this point. I don't mean, what I mean by materialist studies of innovation is really old school history, sociology, and economics of technology and business. And my point is that ultimately conceptual and materialist histories of innovation should be brought together, and that doing so allows us to see some important things. The final caveat is that I'm very aware of my limits here. I'm going to mostly focus on examples drawn from the United States because of the innovation delusion of my new book project. I think a lot of what I'm going to say in the second half of my talk also applies to Europe, as some of the economist Robert Gordon's publications suggest, and to countries like Japan. But the picture is much more complex in China and rapidly developing areas of Africa. So a larger, kind of more systematic consideration of these topics how they're playing out globally will have to wait until later, and it would be a much more complex picture. My final caveat, I've had a breakthrough COVID case the last couple of weeks, so I'm still not at 100%. So the good news is that if you disagree with anything I say, you can just blame it on me being sick or something. But I just want to kind of acknowledge my limits going in. All right, so here's Benoît. This is not the best picture. It's not the highest quality picture, but I really wanted to use one of the pictures that exist of him on the internet with his hat on, because his hat was so iconic, and he always had his hat with him, at least when I was around him. I first met Benoît when I was a graduate student at Carnegie Mellon University, and my doctoral advisor, David Hounshell, brought Benoît in to give a talk in a kind of innovation and industrial change group that David ran with the now late economist Stephen Klepper, who also died too young from cancer. And at that point, I went out to dinner with them and stuff. I liked Benoît a lot. I didn't totally at that point have my head around what he was up to. I thought his talk was really fascinating, but I just didn't understand his project. That came a couple years later. And so for me, the study of innovation was born out of frustration with the way that innovation and entrepreneurship, those two terms, got thrown around so often at Carnegie Mellon, by the way. And so when for 2 years between when I was ABD, for 2 years, I lived in Columbia, Missouri, and there I started a project that was called the E and the I words. It was just a side project that I was like pumping in historical stuff to. And that's when I discovered Benoît's project. I can't remember how. I think maybe David pointed me to the website. And that's when I just discovered it and kind of came to understand, what he was up to in a larger way. And my father was a land surveyor, so I like using like geographical metaphors when it comes to Benoît, especially. I really see him as a kind of path breaker in the intellectual history of innovation. I think we sometimes underestimate how difficult it is to start these kind of intellectual histories when you have very little as Benoît had to draw on just to get going, especially when he started. I mean, we already had digital databases, but they're not what we have today. So, I mean, I think that, what it took to get this off the ground was truly a real work of effort and love for him. There are no guideposts for him. And typically the first goal has to be kind of laying the land. And in this role as a kind of intellectual surveyor, I think Benoît was amazingly free-ranging because he felt that one of his central tasks was to explain how the valences of innovation changed over time, specifically how the kind of valuing of innovation inverted from being a negative thing to a positive thing. He went way back in time, as we see in Innovation Contested. I forgot to mention, but I think another kind of fascinating thing that I wanted to mention is that the website is, I think, I want to say that he's a kind of innovator in something like digital humanities or something like that. The fact that he built this website and was producing papers first and foremost to the website, they would often get bundled into other things. He was really kind of forward thinking in how he thought of his project and the way he structured it, right? And I think that we need to acknowledge that too, that he was doing something in a very kind of public manner that was kind of just like not well accepted in academia when he was starting this. We didn't have academia.edu and stuff like this when he was starting. And in his free-ranging thinking, I think this is from the website too. Like one of the themes that he tracks is innovation theology. Now, you could say, well, this is, an artifact of this pushing back to the earlier history and trying to understand where innovation came from. But that's not really the scope of what he's doing. I mean, he was working on the topic of innovation theology all the way up to the point that he died, basically. This is a theme that he continued to follow through in his work. And maybe some of you know him better would tell me that, that he was working on a book. I would not be surprised if this was headed in some direction. But I think this work is really important, not only because we have to understand how innovation came out of theological roots, but because I think that, I'm kind of a post-secular thinker, and that I think that we kid ourselves that we're all like secular atheists or something. I think religious ideas continue to live on in our speech and the way we think about the world. And I think this is very true of innovation. Okay. I think that there is a kind of theological valence to the way we think and talk about innovation all the time. And the fact that, there is even messianism in innovation, right? It's going to save us like Jesus was going to save us or something like that. And so I think that this is a really beautiful thing that he was up to and continued to trace forward. I would love to see where he was going to go with this. And finally, I'm not going to talk about the models book. I haven't even had a chance to check out this book. I only discovered it like a few weeks ago when I was starting to prepare the newer book, The Idea of Technological Innovation. I haven't had a chance to look at it. My library doesn't have it. I'm forcing Virginia Tech to buy it. But what I understand of his argument from reading about it online is that part of the thing that he's focusing on is that we have tended to focus too much on academic theorists of innovation, and that really when we look at how the idea of innovation changed and diffused over the last 50 years or so, it's much more in the kind of professional world of consultants and business leaders and stuff like that. I think that's totally true. I see that in my own reading of the records. And if you look at, when I was at Linda Hall Library here in the States, which is a great research library that everyone should go to if they have a chance, just kind of going in it, you just searching for documents that mention innovation from the 50s through the 80s. It's much more professional reports from government and professional documents that it is the academic works. They're citing academic economists and stuff, but it's much more in this professional literature. So I think this is it's fascinating, and I think that I can't wait to read it. Now, I think that I'll come back to Benoît again. I think that because I see him as so foundational, and I'll be citing him for the rest of my life. Like the honor that that I bestow on his work is just enormous. I think that he really not only did something unique and original, but I think that he has given us so much that we can take going forward. Very early on, I came to see that I had a different kind of read on, or different approach to innovation studies than he did. And Andy Russell and I started talking about this when we were writing the Innovation Delusion. Now, we weren't actually talking about Benoît that often. We were also talking about Matt Wisnowski, my colleague at Virginia Tech, and other people who were kind of writing about the intellectual history of innovation. And I think that when Andy and I were wrestling kind of like with where we sat with things, we're trying to understand why. And I think part of it came down to our training. So I think that, one thing that differed where we're coming from that from Benoît is that our approach was that influential people, our belief was that influential people were doing all kinds of like immoral, heinous things in the name of innovation. And that's like our primary angle on innovation speak was always kind of Western traditions of criticism and critical theory. I mean, we're coming from, Andy and I aren't Marxists. I'll talk about that later, but we come from that kind of background. I wrote my senior thesis in undergrad on like Foucault and Habermas. That's my undergrad training, is like in that kind of stuff. Okay. So I come from that kind of critical background, and that's kind of my angle into this topic specifically. Not all my work's like that, but this one very much. But the second thing is that Andy and I were both trained first and foremost as historians of technology and business. My doctoral advisor, as I mentioned earlier, was David Hounshell, whose work stands still, I think, as the best existing histories of mass production in the US and research and development. Andy's primary advisor was at Johns Hopkins was Bill Leslie, the historian of technology, but he also trained under business and organizational historian Lou Galambos. And one significant common denominator between Hounshell and Galambos was a close working relationship and friendship with Alfred Chandler, the famed business historian. There's lots of, Chandler, there's lots of criticisms and revisions of Chandler. No one believes that Chandler was like totally right anymore. The point is that, this is kind of like paradigmatic business history. And so Andy and I were trained to think about technological artifacts and systems, how they change in the context of large scale corporations present in advanced industrial capitalism. And this work led both to Andy's first book on the history of communication standards. So Andy wrote, before he did this work, he wrote a book on basically the history of the internet, but it goes all the way back to the Bell system and AT&T. And it led to my first book on the history of regulatory automobile standards in the United States. And the moving violations really puts forward a theory of how regulation spurs on innovation and technological change. That's really what the book's about, is how does government shape technological change? I think as historians of business and technology, what most struck me and Andy about the discourse of innovation as it existed in the last couple decades, at least, was its unreality or irreality, or just kind of lack of touching like how innovation actually worked in the world. So the gap between discourse of innovation, how change actually occurred in technology and business. And so the most important question in our eyes and for our project was something like, all of this innovation speak is great, but had it translated into actual innovation, and the benefits that accrue from innovation. Now, this is where I want to get specific when I talk about what, beyond what Benoît and I were talking about. So at an event held by Matt Wisnowski, Eric Hinson, Marie Stetler-Klein that led to an edited volume, I was given the duty of commenting on papers in a panel. And I asked Benoît where the conceptual history of innovation connected to material reality and how we might judge whether all of innovation chatter kind of actually worked. And he said, I was asking an enormous question and perhaps implying that in that context, I was being unfair. And I think that was basically right, but still, I wish that Benoît and I had more time to talk about this issue, about the kind of relationship to between the conceptual and material change, and most of all, how to connect them. And I'll talk about this a bit later, is how do we connect conceptual histories with materialist ones. So for Andy and I then, we increasingly came to focus on this distinction between actual innovation, the process of introducing new technologies and practices in the world, and innovation speak, the way we've come to talk and think about technological and business change in the post-World War II period. And as we began research for the book, we found that the gap between innovation speak and actual innovation was even worse than we initially assumed. And so, here's kind of like, I'm going to show you a couple of Google Ngrams. You guys are all familiar with this. Benoît used them sometimes. Everyone who does this kind of conceptual work uses them. I pumped in the word innovation, and what we're seeing here is patterns of usage over time. Okay. So use of the word innovation remains static from like 1800. It even goes down a little bit to about the late 50s. And then it shoots up. There's especially steep periods in the 60s and the 90s. And, the question's why. And this is, what Benoît and Matt Wisnowski and Andy and I have been trying to, and lots of other people at this point, and not even at this point, but lots of other people have been trying to explain what's going on here. And, Andy and I tend to rely on, which something Benoît and Matt also write about, is like the role of economists like Solow and other people who are discovering in the late 1950s, early 1960s, that technological change is giving rise to, economic growth, basically. And then, in my reading of the documents that I've looked at from the US government and other things in the 1960s, they're all referencing Solow. So, in the US case, at least, the reports are all about how do we get more of this innovation thing. So here's kind of, this is innovation speak is rising from, the late 50s to 2008 in this picture. And then for a long time, Google Ngram cut off at 2008. And we're all like, so what's it do, man? Like, does it go up? Is it continue to increase? Does it decrease? Does it plateau? And then last year, they updated it finally. And here we go. It just keeps going up and up and up. Okay. We have more and more talk about innovation. So does that mean we have more and more innovation, but economically significant innovation? And I think that, here I'm going to start drawing on, what I call materialist studies of innovation. So a very important book for us, this is a 2016 book by Robert Gordon, The Rise and Fall of Economic Growth. He uses one measure of technological innovation that's pretty well known to people who look at these kind of growth statistics: total factor productivity. And you can see that total factor productivity is increasing okay from 1890 to 1920. Then it goes up really high from 1920 to 1970 as all kinds of technologies are being introduced. You have automobiles and airplanes and concrete, steel buildings. I mean, there's just so much happening in this period between 1920 and 1970. Then the economy hits the skids in around the 1970s. This happens in Europe too. It's a very famous problem. Question why? And we have low productivity from the 70s to the 1990s. Then there's a bump from 1994 to 2004. Gordon's hypothesis is this is very basic stuff like email, Microsoft Office, PDFs. That's all that very basic office technology is, and the internet is what he thinks is going on. Then, then we have one of the lowest periods, basically the lowest periods of productivity change on the record from 2004 to 2014, which is where it cuts off for Gordon. This low productivity keeps going until the present. Okay, and there was a productivity bump in Q1 of this year, and there's debates about what's going on there. We can talk about that later if it interests you. But the point is, like, with the exception of this 10-year period in the 90s to 2004, productivity remains low. Total factor productivity increases remain low, and this is precisely the period that innovation speak is rising and rising and rising and rising. And it's not just Gordon. There's lots of other kind of markers of kind of low rates of innovation and productivity. There's this now famous paper, Are Ideas Getting Harder to Find, which is an argument about, that we've kind of taken up all the low-hanging fruit. That's we could look at the history of low-hanging fruit as a concept, but that just doing things like computer chips, for instance, you have to bring many more people and money to get that bump in improvement in chips than you needed in like the 60s or 70s, right? And this applies to pharmaceuticals. It applies to all kinds of industry. Research productivity is going down. And then this is kind of more of like, I would not say like a heavyweight type of journal study, but Patrick Collison and a co-author. Patrick Collison's the CEO of the e-commerce company Stripe. He has this paper that kind of synthesizes all this research on why innovations kind of slowed down. And what he finds is he did a little survey of like Nobel laureates and found that most of them think the earliest Nobel Prize discoveries and inventions were more significant than the ones that are more recent. And Collison and his co-author basically argue this is another low-hanging fruit thing, that the biggest discoveries came earlier, and then we're kind of getting smaller and smaller as time goes on. Now, innovation, like this thing that Benoît and Matt and, again, all of it, like we just say the whole Novation community at this point. I will say the Novation community, we like during this period where we see innovation, the pro-innovation bias, as some people put it, develop. Everyone, we want innovation because it gives rise to economic growth and jobs and quality of life improvements and all these kinds of things, right? This opens up huge space for what Matt Wisnowski calls innovation experts, and Andy and I call innovation experts in quotation marks, which are people who are going to come and tell you like how to innovate, all right? But I think on reanalysis of many of these folks, they just don't hold up to like strong social scientific examination. So Clayton Christensen, famously introduced the late Clayton Christensen. He introduced the notion of disruptive innovation in The Innovator's Dilemma. Obviously, this is a kind of morphing or changing of Schumpeter's creative destruction. But you did disruptive innovation, disruption, just like it's become so popular in culture. There's actually someone writing about the notion of disruption, a dissertation on the notion of disruption in Silicon Valley and what it means and what it does. If you're worried about being disrupted or, wanted to be a disruptor, you could hire Christensen's consulting group, InnoSight, where I guess they would come put like innovation goggles on you. Then now you could see innovation or like happening around you. So you have the InnoSight. Consulting, the role of, this is where I really agree with Benoît about innovation, that his new book, and want to read it. Consultants play a really fundamental role in spreading these these innovation ideas around. But when, there's a number of studies, there's Jill Lepore's article in The New Yorker, there's this article, How Useful is the Theory of Disruptive Innovation? There's a number of other things. When social scientists re-examined Christensen's own data to take this case, like only 9% this article here finds that only 9% of Christensen's actual examples of disruptive innovation actually fit his own definition of disruptive innovation. So, and reanalysis has found that disruptive innovation is not nearly as important as Christensen said, nor is it as common. Okay, to say nothing about whether you can actually pursue it as a strategy or something like that. It's just not as important to the economy. Okay, and there's a kind of misunderstanding about how actual innovation happens. All right, here's like a little moment of comic relief. There was two, now there's three self-help books that you use the disruption idea and apply it to your soul or something. So a joke I like to make is I got the one on the left by Whitney Johnson, hoping it was going to be about like going out late, drinking with friends, then eating a bunch of greasy food right before you go to sleep, because that's a really good way to disrupt yourself, I've found. But sadly, it's just like a normal self-help book that happens to use the jargon of disruptive innovation. But you know, like, hey, let's talk about how this connects to theology. You know, like, let's talk about how this connects to Benoît's theory, you know, work on the kind of theology of innovation and, you know, the soul and the self and stuff like that. Okay, Richard Florida, he had this notion of the creative class, which, you know, I say is kind of like, there was this bad American movie from the 80s or 90s called Field of Dreams with Kevin Costner, where like they build a baseball stadium in the middle of a cornfield somewhere, and then ghosts start coming. And there's a voice that says, if you build it, they will come. And so I say, like, the creative class is kind of like that, only applied to hipsters, right? Like, what you want to do in the creative class theory is like make your city very appealing to a certain class of people, and then they will create innovation and economic growth for you. But this too, I mean, there's been several pieces done at this point. There is no kind of social scientific backing to say that this actually worked. And if anything, our cities, you know, we can talk about how cities changed and became more unequal. This stuff doesn't work. I've written about design thinking as a kind of misunderstanding of innovation processes and how this is kind of a very hype thing without much evidence. And I think we can also add to this kind of list of innovation expertise and like ideas that have no much grounding in reality, innovation campuses, science parks. This is a over $1 billion, I think it's $1.6 billion innovation campus we're building for Amazon's headquarters 2 near Washington, D.C. Virginia Tech is doing this, my university. You know, the research on innovation campuses that exist today show they don't create innovation and economic growth. Technology transfer offices are another. Most technology transfer offices in the United States are in the red. They are not profit-making organizations the way they have been argued for. On top of this, I think, you know, you have waves upon waves upon waves of kind of overhyped technologies that haven't delivered on promises. So we can talk about the 90s and, you know, be afterwards with biotech and genetic engineering, nanotechnology. I will talk more about that. That's my favorite example to beat up on. You know, we talk about AI, the multiple waves of AI and the hype around that. AVs, you know, Elon Musk a couple of years ago, we were supposed to have autonomous vehicles by now already, according to some kind of boosters. They're not here. And you can add your own kind of examples. Now, I think we have some really nice, I'm going to beat up on my field of STS in a couple of minutes here and talk about how we've fallen down on this stuff often, but we do have some nice, really nice studies. And I think I could add more here of how we have kind of, you know, overly optimistic projections of near-term technological change over several around several different kinds of technologies. That's what I call hype, what I just said, over like unrealistic near-term projections, and then how they don't play out. So I would, on the EdTech score, we have both Morgan Ames's book, The Charisma Machine, which is about the one laptop per child project, and then Christo Sim's Disruptive Fixation, which is about a charter school in New York. Both are studies of kind of like how people like said education technology was going to revolutionize education, you know, in specific schools and around the globe, and how these two programs just fell to pieces, basically. Before I kind of started my new book project, someday I will write a book project called Why Software Fails, which is going to be a study of why there's so much failure in the software adoption process. Some of that research is being wrapped into my current book project, the Good History project about jobs, because kind of the idea that, you know, digital technologies were going to revolutionize productivity in what was around since, you know, like at least the 80s. We could go back farther. And yet when we look at actual software adoption, you know, there are high rates, you know, there is vast different estimates of how often failure goes. There's big debates in the space, but it's by some, according to some estimates, like 70% of software adoption efforts fall apart. Now, other people say it's more like 20%. Some people say it's more like 30%. I actually don't care, because like if like say like let's say it's 20% of your adoption efforts are falling apart, that is a lot of wasted human effort and money that might explain why productivity shifts with software is much smaller and slower than kind of boosters have projected, is because failure rates are so high. Now, the most beautiful way to see software failure is to look for like big lawsuits against companies like Oracle and SAP, especially. Those are like when a big lawsuit against SAP, the kind of enterprise software company, comes out. That is a juicy thing to look at. It like what went wrong? Why is it so hard to adopt these large you know, software systems in complex organizations? And there's a lot of really interesting questions. This is out of place. I meant to put this earlier after Gordon, but what I want to say here briefly is that the idea that we're experiencing low productivity and have for a long time now is now, I mean, 5 or 6 years ago, this was a hard thing to sell. And, you know, it wasn't that common to see it around other than Gordon and a couple other people. Now it's like a mainstream view. And you can see it because here's a New York Times op-ed by Paul Krugman, and he is beating up on Andrew Yang, who is this startup kind of founder, and he first ran for president, then he ran to be the mayor of New York. Okay, and what Krugman is saying here is, you know, if we're seeing automation spread through the economy, as he says, that would imply a rapid rise in the amount of stuff produced by each worker still employed. That is rapidly rising productivity. That's not what we're seeing. And, you know, then he goes into like what we're seeing, you know, like from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and other statistical bodies, is the historically low growth in productivity since 2005, just like I told you. So my point here is just that this is now kind of mainstream stuff, but for a long time it wasn't. I want to highlight the work of my buddy and now soon to be co-author Jeffrey Funk, because I think he's been doing really wonderful and clever studies of kind of hype around new technologies and the economic reality around these new technologies. So he does this really nice piece that I think everyone should read called AI and Economic Productivity, Expect Evolution, Not Revolution. In this piece, he examined the 40 top AI firms and what they were doing to the degree that they're allowed to, the degree that they're actually disclosing what they're up to publicly. And what he finds is that very few of these companies are going to have really any impact on productivity. They're not aiming to. They're not doing that kind of work. And it's going to take a long time. Okay. And so contrary to the boosters of like, you know, the fourth industrial revolution people and stuff like that, this is going to be a very slow and evolutionary process, according to the kind of best studies of this stuff, unless, you know, the Terminator shows up tomorrow or whatever. Like, you know, no one can predict the future. I will end with that thought. Another study he's done is where have all the profitable startups gone? And what he shows is that new unicorns, whether they're IPOs or still private, are highly unprofitable compared to earlier decades. Okay, so the percentage of profitable unicorns is 18% now, and this compares with 80% of profitable firms and startups founded in the 1980s. So firms have become very unprofitable for a variety of reasons. But one of them, this is, by the way, a 3-part series he did for a kind of online magazine that I think is really nice. You know, one of them is that he looks at Uber. It's, you know, he says its service is marginally more convenient than that of a taxi service because rides can be booked from phones, but it still uses the same type of vehicles, drivers, roads as taxi services do. So, I mean, where is the profit and growth going to come from ultimately? And now Uber is trying to actually chase profits. They have a new CEO and they're trying to actually become profitable. Well, guess what? As they're doing so in a lot of American cities now, it's cheaper to take a taxi than it is an Uber. So like in the quest to become profitable, their prices are going up. Can't believe it. And now they're becoming less competitive, right? So where is the opportunity here? The kind of materialist opportunity is the way I'll talk about it. And, you know, here's a piece that, this is the final Jeff Funk piece. I'm writing a piece. It's mostly Jeff's research. He just wants to bring me in. I'm kind of helping formulate ideas, but this is the quantitative side of it is Jeff's work. And I really want to emphasize that. So he's looking at, the piece is called The Era, titled right now, The Era of Big Promises. And what he's doing is looking at, what we're doing is looking at the earlier period of digital innovation versus what we've been experiencing over the last decade. So e-commerce, internet hardware, software, and mobile service revenues had reached 446 billion, 300, you can see it here, these numbers, respectively by 2000 in 2020 dollars. So he's trying to say like about 10 years after these things started, within a decade of these things being introduced, they had already reached these vast sums of money. Okay, now let's look at the fastest growing and most hyped technologies of the last decade: video streaming, big data, smart homes. It goes all the way down to commercial drones and blockchain. These are much smaller markets. Okay, much smaller markets. And when it comes to innovation and economic growth and productivity, video streaming like YouTube and Netflix is one of the largest markets here, and it's not going to affect productivity positively, right? If anything, the fact that I hang out on YouTube or Netflix when I should be writing academic papers is a decrease in productivity, right? And I'm not alone. Like the apps and stuff decrease productivity all the time. Now, I think in general, and here's, I'll get a little controversial for a second. I think in general, one of the fields I work in, STS has done a very poor job on the issues I'm talking about here. And the reason I think this is because it's been so close to emerging technologies since at least the 90s, but I think we can go earlier. There's very rarely pulled back from and looked at the place of these emerging technologies in a larger industrial and technological context. And so I like to beat up on ASU, a lot, Arizona State University, around this stuff a lot. I especially look at the nanotechnology stuff. So here's an example. Here's Susan Cousins, who I think is at Georgia Tech, and here's Jamie Wetmore. They put together this edited volume, Nanotechnology and the Challenges of Equity, Equality, and Development. From the book description, I've actually read this thing, but here's the book, part of the book description. Nanotechnology is enabling applications in materials, microelectronics, health, and agriculture, which are projected to create the next big shift in production comparable to the Industrial Revolution. Okay, such major shifts always co-evolve with social relations. This book focuses on nanotechnologies might affect equity, equality, and global society. Nanotechnologies are likely to open gaps by gender, ethnicity, race, and ability status. Now, my dad joke here is like, it turns out in the United States, we could, increase inequality around race, gender, and just economically without nanotechnology, it turned out. We didn't need the nanotechnology industry to blow up in the way that kind of boosters predicted to have increasing inequality. We could do it with perfectly normal technologies, non-nanotechnologies, or what we needed to increase inequality. So, what I'm interested in is, going back to this TFP chart, is what this lack of innovation means. In lack of innovation, meaningful, social, economically significant innovation in the context of high innovation speak means for daily life, okay? And I think the reality is the lack of innovation, when combined with the forces of globalization, has had devastating consequences for American workers, especially non-college educated American workers. And this is very important to say, it's affected both racial minorities and whites, okay? So we can look at William Julius Wilson's book, When Work Disappears, which looks at deindustrialization in American cities and how it affected Black people because there was no work available, there were no opportunities available. And more recently, there's this book, Deaths of Despair, by Ann Case and Angus Deaton, which looks at how non-college educated whites are increasingly dying from suicide, drug overdoses, especially opioids, alcoholism, and all these things they call deaths of despair. They also marry less. They have there's a lot of sad markers when it comes to these folks. So this is kind of where I'm going with my, my new book project, which I call A Good History of Shit Jobs. It's basically a history of the U.S. economy around technology, globalization, policy making, and then jobs over the last 50 years. And my point here about policy making is I think that this is where, the actual innovation and innovation speak comes back into play. Because I think that it's a bipartisan, the Democrats and Republicans in the US case, they both love innovation. They both have different ideas about how to get it. But they both, I think, fundamentally, you can kind of show historically, they both fundamentally misunderstand what's going on and what is needed. So, just to give one example that I've been looking at, I've been studying the economist Robert Reich. I don't know if he's known in Europe, but he's very kind of well known here in the States. And one of the things I've become really fascinated is how Democrats in the 90s and beyond, Reich starts a little earlier, became obsessed with college education as the answer to inequality and all these things, and just the answer to the economy in general. Okay, they encourage students to take out massive amounts of loans. You've probably heard about the college debt problem. And because we've now overproduced college graduates for the amount of jobs, actually college wages for college grads have stagnated, gone down. Okay, so I think they fundamentally misrecognize what's happening in the economy. And so, what I think that the plea, I think that in my own kind of understanding, and I've been talking about this with my friends, is a real need to focus on materialism. And I mean that both in the kind of Marxist social relations sense, but also in the material change kind of Hounshellian sense, that the reason we've gotten all these benefits from economic growth and innovation is because the way material realities change. For instance, mass production's allowed us to make things very cheap. So we all, everyone on the planet, not everyone on the planet, many people on the planet, including in places like, Africa, China, and Latin America, can now live much more wealthy in terms of quality of life than they could 100 years ago because of material change. And so I think that, this is like what I would have loved to talk to Benoît about, and I will never have the chance to do so, but I think that, I can talk to you about it, is, how do we bring together kind of conceptual histories of innovation and, policy making around innovation, for instance, with studies, economic and historical studies of technological change and material change. Now, okay, this is my last caveat. I am not a prophet. I don't make predictions. I'm a historian. So I have to say this. This is like, I got to build it in somewhere in the talk, say I don't talk about the future. Anyone, everyone can say, like, the fourth industrial revolution people and Brynjolfsson and McAfee and like the second machine age people and all kinds of other boosters of digital technologies say, well, we just haven't learned how to use these things yet, and change is on the horizon. And I say, okay, you've been telling me that for a decade. I look forward to it showing up, buddy, is what I say. But like, that doesn't change the point that of this kind of chart from the 1970s to the present. Okay. And it doesn't change the actual kind of damage and things that have been done to people's lives, including suffering and death and poverty and stuff that has come from this lack of innovation in the context of high innovation speak. Okay. And I think that's where I want to stop. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was very, very insightful, very inspiring. We'll have a list So if you want to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand or put a little note in the chat. I'll note the list, and then I'll hope I can keep the line of speakers. And because I'm moderator, I have the freedom to put myself on the list first. So I found it very, very interesting that, and I found myself being reminded of the conference I was at with archaeologists. And we're talking about the wheel, and they wanted to know about innovation theories. And what they told me is that when humankind invented the wheel, they didn't really have a use for it. So it was used in toys and in cultist practices for about 2,000 years, but basically it was just lying around. And then only very, very late, did somebody like kind of put the wheel to other uses. So I think humankind has a long history of, in a way, being inventive, but not really knowing what to do with it. And so I thought from your talk also, we have the feeling that, there is innovation potential, but then there is, we don't really know what to do with it. And now my question is how the actual innovation and the innovation speak interact, and especially when we look at it from an STS perspective, because it seems like you have in a way, also a normative understanding of what an actual innovation is. It's probably something that really does something transformative. And then there's innovation speak, which is somehow ephemeral, discursive. And I, at the moment, am at a university, University of Twente, which is an entrepreneurial university, understands itself as a very innovative university. And, there, the innovation speak becomes quite real in what you have to do and what is expected of you, and so it's it turns into something real. So what, from an STS perspective, how could we understand the innovation speak in a more material and realistic way of what it actually does than just being speak?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is exactly the question that I would have liked to talk to Benoît about. I mean, I think that we can look at historians like Adam Tooze and other people who study STS of economics, who look at how ideas become material realities and things kind of like are changed in the name of ideas. And this is the issue that I think precisely what we need more case studies of. I think that to your university example, that's a beautiful example, actually, okay? Because we are restructuring universities in all kinds of ways, in ways that most humanities and social sciences professors feel are very damaging, right? And they really think that it is kind of undermining traditional education and the way they understand that we should be doing things, right? In the name of, like, I'm thinking of John Pablo Pardo Guerra's study that he's working on of metrics in the British academic system, for instance, okay? So I think that that's really important. We have to study about how changes are being wrought around these ideas. We are changing institutions. This is something we say in the in the book a lot. We are fundamentally reorganizing basic institutions in our society, including the university, the government, big corporations, in the name of this concept. That's what we have to capture. But my point, where the kind of normative understanding is like, where is the evidence that these changes actually produce what we're chasing? When I look at like technology transfer offices, and I look at innovation campuses, and I look at all these things that we're doing to universities, there's almost no evidence that this stuff actually produces what it's supposed to produce. It is producing something. It's producing change. It's producing pressure on Cornelius to be innovative and put in his faculty activity report that he did this or that, and maybe he patented something, God knows. He made an app or whatever, right? But like, so it's producing change, but is it producing the change that you're actually chasing is a question that I think we have to keep our eyeballs on. So that's, I think but the question that you're asking is primarily like exactly what I think we need to be talking about, is how do we relate conceptual histories to histories of material change? And I think again, I would hold up Adam Tooze as like one hero for me, of someone who does both. He studies economic thought and he studies actual economies, and so yeah.
Thanks very much. I don't see a raised hand at the moment, but Monica has shared 2 slides. Maybe you want to give a quick comment. And then I see a hand by Andreas. So Monica first.
Well, more than comments, I attached 2 slides with a quick search by internet. So, because I think that I agree completely with you, but maybe to the materialist story of innovation, we can talk about other and not so materialist history at the same time. Sorry, Adrian, because I search also for green innovation, but not with so good results. You can share maybe the slides. Have you, Cornelius? Yeah. You know?
Yeah. I think they're there for everybody in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got it.
It called my attention because I think that social innovation is overlapped with technological innovation. And we can see different kind of discourses when we explore in more detail all the semantic of the meaning of innovation. That to my view is far to be resolved.
Yeah,
we need to understand what innovation really means. This is so just only a comment about this, because at the same time, when we talk about growth and the rates, at the same time, I have in mind a lot of results, a lot of discourses and narratives about all the scientific knowledge production that is opposite, maybe, to many of the authors you mentioned. And to me, really, right now, I need to read again a lot of different discourses. For example, all the narrative about transhumanism is opposite.
Yeah.
And also provides some numbers, some rates.
Okay.
Well, can I respond? I have thoughts.
Yeah, please.
Oh yeah. So I think that I'm on. I'm pretty quiet on the editorial board of NOvation, but I get I read the emails, and I think there's a special issue coming, or at least a proposed special issue on social innovation. I think that this could be really interesting. Okay. But I want to read all the pieces. That's why I hope it comes together. And the reason is like, we purposefully set aside social innovation in the way we write about this topic, Andy and I, and we focus on economic innovation. And I really like, my kind of, critical Marxist, whatever, sense is that social innovation is really marked by like, well, this is STS too, is like solutionism, technological fixes, are very common in this discourse. If you read like the Stanford Social Innovation Journal, which I've spent a lot of time in, it's a very solutionist picture of cultural change. And I think that, which I'm critical of for all kinds of reasons, including because I think deep social structures are really important. And I also think that it's a kind of spreading of the innovation idea out to beyond economic change to all these kind of things until it just becomes meaning good or improvement, or it's progress in the old sense. We've stopped talking about progress. Now we talk about innovation. And so I'm really, again, I would say like, when I look at the history of the United States and social improvements, I look at things like the early feminist movement and the fight for women to vote. I look at civil rights movement. I look at the gay rights movement, and I look at what these people were up to. and how they did that, I think that's very different than what I see coming out of the Stanford Innovation Journal. And again, I don't need like economic measures. I'm very skeptical of these things. They're helpful because they undermine the story that we've been telling ourselves. You can use the economic measures to, show that the way people are talking about things is upended. That's why it's useful. So I don't need economic measures of social innovation, but I would need some kind of, just personally, some kind of evidence that this social innovation movement is really that effective at generating the kind of changes that they think they are. I'm very skeptical of it, I would say.
Okay, I agree with you about that. Innovation should not be a holy grail, okay? But right now I need to read a lot of
yeah. No, and I think it's a worthwhile project. What Andy and I point out is that according to economic definitions of innovation, crack cocaine was very obviously an economic innovation in the 1980s. It literally disrupts powder cocaine. It's cheap. There's a lot of risky entrepreneurship around it called drug dealing. It is innovation, and so is the opioid epidemic. So there's a lot of things that are obviously economic innovations that are bad. So and then it's like, how does it become that we treat the concept as an automatic good in terms of social innovation when in economics, it's not so clear, so there's a real question to be made about how we value innovation and what we're doing with valuation.
Well, finally, my final comment, what caught my attention is that, for example, in the case of European policies, we can see a lot of a diversity of sectors. For instance, the cultural sector, the green sector, a lot of sectors. And maybe we need to capture all the global picture about this.
I totally agree with you.
Because I don't see in your slides about rates and growth, this representation, and well, it's the last comment.
Yeah, no, I just talked about.
Thanks again.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, then we'll move on with Andreas.
Yes, so thank you, Lee, very much for your talk. And I have to say, I like your project of a materialist history of innovation very much. And if I got it right, the main move is, to compare the promises of innovation speak to the actual effects on work and everyday life, etc. But also, of course, in the companies involved. And I would like to hear your thoughts on what is it that we are actually or should be comparing. Is it to compare if the outcomes of some innovation project is fitting to the promises that it came with, or do we need something else that we should take as a to compare, which would be a much richer innovation understanding. I think the same idea is or might be behind the comment of in the chat by Joost. So to speak, do we need an understanding of innovation developed from ourselves, which would be a richer social and SDG perhaps driven idea of innovation?
Well, can you just say the last part one more time, because I want to make sure I understand the.
Should we compare the innovation speak when we are comparing the innovation speak promises to the actual effects? Should we just look at, did the promises come out as promised, or should we compare innovation in a much broader social sense, which would, for example, look at the sustainable development goals, so have a much broader understanding of innovation in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the answer is I want both, right? I think there is something to the Hegelian kind of comparison of like the promises and the reality. That dialectic is, I think, important. Now, I always think in every emerging industry, we can go back to like the whole history of industrial society. I think there's always hype around new technologies that exceeds what actually happens. So that in itself is not surprising. But in this case, what we're looking at is a kind of way of talking that it is meant to be turned into practice, and that practice is supposed to have certain outcomes, right? And I think we need to ask specifically about whether it's having the promised outcomes that it's supposed to be having. But I think your point about SDGs, I mean, I think that there's all kinds of questions about, I mean, we can get into like, this is what I do in I'm teaching a class called Innovation in Context right now. What I try to do in that class is teach about how innovation actually works, okay? And what we know about innovation in industrial civilization for the last 200 years. There's a lot of, the first half of the course is like myth busting, because it's like, look, it's not startups, it's not the great man, it's not this, it's not that, right? It's not science, it's not primarily science focused like industries. It's like incremental innovation. It's mostly an incremental, and it mostly happens in big corporations, and it mostly is, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I think that once you have that better understanding, you can ask, how do we do better with this stuff? Okay. And for me, I'm totally on board with where you go with the SDG thing. I want this, you know, like our industrial systems to be much more focused on global well-being and you know, fighting climate change and all these kinds of things that I wrote about in my first book, right? About regulation. How do we get from bad place to good place? So I want both, you know, but I think that we can't lose sight of the first part of it.
Yeah, just to add just one idea, because your examples of how apps, for example, distract you from work instead of making you more productive was striking, because it leads not only to the idea of side effects, you know, which were not expected but happen all the time. And well, this is just
well, I mean, like, think about, you know, I talk about this in my class too. So there's reasons I'm focusing on the economic story, okay? But think about like Facebook or social media, and then think about our relationships to ourselves and selfie taking and how I mean, there's all these changes that have been wrought by these technologies. The way, you know, politics have gotten crazy, especially in my country, maybe, you know, like, so like, there's all these kinds of social impacts of new technologies. That's also important to think about, for sure. Quality of life and these kinds of things. I'm totally with you there. Yeah.
Okay, so we have two more on the list now. Carolina is first, and then it's Karina.
Thank you. Thank you, Vinsel, for the amazing speech. I got so excited. I got amazed by the way you highlight the gap between actual innovation versus innovation speak. And in your speech, at some point, you mentioned that STS is doing a bad job here. Could you explore a bit more on this idea? And also, how do you think the critical studies of innovation, we hope we are following in a good way Benoît's heritage, could help to cover this gap? Yeah,
thank you. Both good. So I meant to, first of all, there was a slide I meant to put in that that I realized in my talk, and I want to mention, it's a good time to mention, I had a slide that was Aaron Benenav's book, Automation and the Future of Work, and Robert Brenner's Global Turbulence. I can't remember that name of that book. Both of them, Benenav is updating Brenner's argument to show that automation and AI are not having economic consequences, and the stagnant economies are coming from another place, which they think is global overproduction. Basically, they think our factory capacity on the planet has exceeded demand because there's so much factory capacity at this point, and that's what's leading to low growth. And so to your point, Karina, when I look at the story that I tell in today and the evidence that I've drawn on, the people who are looking at this problem are coming from economics, business schools, and history. Benenav and Brenner are both historians, and I can point to other historians too. Okay, they are not people who hang out at 4S, the main STS conference. And I think that, you know, we can just go to the 4S. I love to do it with my grad students and just go to 4S 4S is like they have those public panels that you can join, and you can just go through it and be like, what is STS? All right, it's AI, biotech, green something. You know, you can just, it's all emerging technologies. I mean, there's very few people who are kind of pulling back and looking at the story that I'm looking at here. And, you know, again, I would just say, go back to it and say, the number of STS scholars I draw on to tell this story are very few. There are, you know, I can name people like Ames and Sims and Guardo Pera, and there's other folks I can name, you know, Daniel Bressau, my colleague, but most of them are coming for other fields. And so that would be my kind of evidence. That's the evidence I would present for my argument, that this is a story that STS has missed for a long time.
Thank you.
And the second part of it, I think that, you know, we need to solve the, you know, we need to think through the question that Cornelius pushed me on, which is the question I'm kind of asking, which is how to think about the relationship between concepts and change on the ground. And I really think that if this community and if the journal can become a place where we're puzzling through those questions for all kinds of reasons, including, you know, Andreas's question about like all the quality of life and these other impacts of technologies, if we can become a community of people puzzling through that, which we already are in some ways, but I think we can, you know, work through further problems, and that's really great. You know, I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff. I asked Matt Wisnowski at one point, I'm like, let's have a critical studies of innovation conference here at Virginia Tech. And he's like, nah, I don't want to go, like, whatever. And I'm like, well, now it's Novation, you know, like, I think that this is could be the kind of place where this happens. And I hope to God that it does become such a thing.
I hope so, Ine. Thank you.
Okay, so now it's Karina's turn, and then I actually forgot a little bit about Joost, who put his question in the chat, so he'll be after Karina, and then it's Adrian's turn, and we have about 15 more minutes. So if you want to ask a question, raise your hand now, because otherwise you might not get to the asking the question. But now we still have enough time for longer questions and longer answers. I'll watch it. If we get more questions, then I'll ask you to be brief. But now, first it's Karina.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Lee, for your presentation. You were talking about changing institutions and that we have to focus in studying this in a deeper way. So do you have any suggestions, or have you studied some specific cases in the US from a historical perspective? Because, I mean, there is this concept of social technologies in the 40s with Karl Popper. And I don't know, how do you see it with this institutional change?
Can you say, I don't know that concept of social technologies, I don't think, or at least it's slipped my COVID brain.
Okay, I can send you some.
Okay, that'd be great.
Source.
So,
yeah.
I mean, setting that aside, can you just kind of re-ask the question then, just so I'm very clear that I know what you're asking?
Yeah, my question is if you have suggestions, and if you have examples in the US.
Yeah. I mean, so like I would hold up, again, going back to Ames and Sims. I think they're very nice studies of specific institutions that were geared towards these kinds of changes in education. Their ethnographies. You know, Sims spent like a year at the charter school where these, you know, supposedly revolutionary, innovative educational changes were supposed to be happening. I would love to see similar studies of like innovation campuses and other kinds of such institutions that are being set up and the promises that are being made around them and what's actually happening. I should have also mentioned this. This is a really important book to me now, and it came out, or I learned about it later. It's called In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, and it's about how innovation campuses are actually like exploit and plunder the communities that they're built in, that, you know, universities are actually like extracting value from communities. So those are the kinds of things I'd like to see more studies of. And then, you know, I would love to see like better studies of the NSF, for instance, to talk about reform, like what kind of changes were made at the NSF around funding, and then the outcomes that have come out of that. There's all kinds of like I-Corps which is like this program that's supposed to turn professors into innovators. I think the outcomes of that are very unclear. I don't know. I mean, so is that the kind of thing? I mean, I can think of lots of specific cases where we've been changing institutions where I think that we could use more nuanced case studies of what's actually happened. Is that the kind of thing you're asking about?
Well, yes, but mostly how to study these changes, how to capture these institutional changes over the time, because it's a very difficult task, right? Like how to really capture this. Yeah,
I mean, so this is something that comes up a lot when I talk to colleagues. They're like, well, intellectual history and like studies of imaginaries, for instance, to use like a popular STS term, are kind of much easier methodologically, because like I can go in an archive and find an imaginary in 5 minutes. If I go to like a new program and it's kind of institutional archive. So I mean, this is like discourse is analysis. This is a famous complaint about discourse analysis. It's easier in this way, but I think this is why, I mean, we need to talk about basic social scientific method. Now, this is something I've talked about in a long time. I think there's not a lot of methodological innovation in STS, and there hasn't been for quite a while. And so, I would say like ethnography is great. If you want to go embed yourself in an innovation campus and watch actually how the programs are built, who's hired, the promises that are made around like corporate partnerships and stuff like this, you can do that. I mean, I think that you can lay your eyes directly on the people who are doing this and what they're saying. And then, I can point to lots of examples around innovation institutes and centers and, campuses in the United States where the corporate partnerships never show up. Right. So you can look at what was said and then what actually develops. That would be one example. And then I think we need to work with economists more. We need to get into, you can look at it in archives. You can certainly look at like what was promised and then what was developed by looking at meeting notes and all these kinds of organizational documents we've used to tell organizational studies for a long time. It's not easy, right? And there's no simple fix. It's the hard work. Right. I think that's why a lot of people have, I don't want to be too dismissive. Why we haven't seen a lot of it done in some cases.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We've got another question in the chat. So there's 3 comments or questions now, 10 minutes left. So I think I'll close the list so we don't run into overtime. And it's Just's turn now.
Yeah, hello folks. I just hopped in this conference just for this particular presentation and discussion. Thanks, Lee. I was a bit disappointed, not that Benoît Godin is dead, but that it's difficult to have a conversation with him because he would have lots of comments on the issue. But Andreas referred to my comment. I really think that we need, I should start differently. In this section where Cornelius works, I am an external PhD student. I work for all my life as a bureaucrat dealing with innovation, subsidies, programs, and things like that. Mm-hmm. The bureaucrats, they ask for the multiplier. And not only in the sense of how far is the investment in this particular innovation idea doubled or tripled by companies, but also what is the multiplier for any kind of objective, social objective. And my point is that is exactly where Godin pinpointed at, and which I miss a little bit in the it's a bit too easy just to criticize. The point is there is investment in all kinds of innovation, and of course most of them are not so proliferated or exaggerated as many books or profits in the beginning answer. But still, it's the only engine left to change something, to transform something in this society. at least in the West, or you should skip it. So that's and engineers know that there is a law of diminishing extra value. The second law of Godin. So why isn't there such a kind of conscience in this particular group, for example? So it's also a bit of a critique of too much easiness in criticism. Sorry.
No, I don't mind being criticized. Let's go for it. I mean, that's good. I think that, like, for my part, I would say that it has to do with what you said about this is the only engine we have left for change, right? We have come to hang so much on technological innovation and what it produces for us. And this is something that comes out of Godin's stuff. It is a theological concept, and it's not just in the States, it's not just the Republicans, it's the Democrats too. It's both sides are hoping that technological innovation is going to produce all these positive benefits. Okay. And I agree with you, engineers are not, engineers understand diminishing returns and all these kinds of stuff. They understand the low-hanging fruit idea. That's not the issue, really. The issue is how politicians and university administrators and all these other actors in society put so much hope in technological change. And this is a very old criticism in STS. This goes all the way back to the 70s, at least, the 60s, actually. And so, for my part, what my book on jobs is about is the need for much deeper social reform. It's a classic lefty critique of these kinds of problems. They no, the problem is social structures that lead to inequality. The problem is social structures that lead to this or that negative outcome. And the only way we will resolve these things ultimately, if that's something we would be interested to do, is political reform. Can we get more benefits out of technology? Sure. But we miss something when we focus so exclusively on innovation. That would be one way of responding to what you're saying.
Okay, unfortunately, I have to watch the time, so we can't keep this conversation going, but maybe we can at another place. It's always another time. Adrian, please.
Thank you, Cornelius, and thank you, Lee. I've been scribbling notes furiously and got a lot to mull over. I really enjoyed your presentation and your work. First, my question's about alternative technologies and maybe kind of initiatives, what we might learn from those, actually often coming from social movements who try to practice technology and innovation and think and speak it in really radically different ways. Yeah. And I think, some of my own research has been looking at that, if you like, and what we can, some of the dilemmas in that sort of approach and strategy. Yeah. And so it's really an invitation for you to share your thoughts on that, because one thing I think that is interesting is that its sort of utopian aspects or its anticipatory aspects do make very vivid and real some of these deeper structural problems and changes that are required. Mm-hmm. And therein lies perhaps their limitation a bit. But actually, I wonder if there's any value in doing that kind of anticipatory work. So, for example, we want, grassroots initiatives around innovative approaches to repair and durability, or commons-based approaches to technologies. And obviously, this picks up on what Karina was asking, I think, as well, is, to make that viable and have a material that these new innovations speak or approaches viable and have a kind of transformational impact does require new institutions around commoning, say, or durability. So, totally. I guess I'm trying to think, I've kind of rambled so much, I've lost the question.
Man, I'm with you 100%.
I mean, if you like, it's a different line of inquiry to the one you're suggesting, I think. You're kind of like punching the balloon of innovation. Yeah. And I'm wondering if there's any value in trying to reset innovation, or is it actually just going to hype up in a different kind of way? Maybe that's a question.
I love it. I mean, this is a wonderful question. We'd love to talk to you about this for like 3 hours or something like that. I mean, I think that I wonder if we need the notion of innovation for that kind of alternative technology and what we hope to accomplish, So I can send you, I have a piece coming out with the Design Museum in London on repair in the future that gets at like circular economy and other kinds of changes that need to happen. I mean, I'm totally into like how we need to reform our system in the name of climate change and all these outcomes. And the other thing I want to say is like, I kind of said it in discussion, but I should make it even clearer. You can take from my presentation that I'm obsessed with like productivity and efficiency, okay, or something like that. Actually, I think these values are terrible in lots of ways, and we've totally screwed ourselves up, including our health and our mental health and all kinds of things. We have bad backs because of this crap. And I think that we have to question those values. They are not necessarily what we're being chasing. The reason I find it helpful to focus on them is precisely because of the questioning thing that allows us to do, right? It's like, these people are saying these changes are going to give us these outcomes. It's not showing up in the numbers. So you got to question what they're saying. But, I think, going back to the SDG question, there's all kinds of ways we can say, no, let's retool our technological system to focus on values that actually matter, and that could be durability and repair. It could be climate change. It could be making objects so they fit the disabled and racial bodies and all these kinds. There's all kinds of things we can hope for, right? That are not going to show up in productivity measures. But that's not what we're hearing from that's not what we're hearing from policymakers around this kind of stuff. So that, you're right, that turns into a totally different question. But then I just for me, the rhetoric of innovation is not helpful unless I'm trying to get money out of a university administrator or something like that, I just want to go a different route and say, we don't need to talk this way. But dude, I would love to talk to you about, like I said, we could hop on Zoom and talk for a long time about that question. It is the question.
Okay, we have one last comment or question in the chat by PR. I'm not sure if you want to verbalize this as a last comment.
Cornelius, just to thank Lee Vinsel, myself also, a quick intervention. Well, I'm a big fan of your work. I'm an historian, I do institutional histories, and I can promise a review of your book, most possibly in Portuguese, which is exotic. I know you have already many reviews. But, my feeling here is hearing you all, is that we know the questions to pose, but we do not have already the answers yet. And I truly believe that Lee Vinsel has at least this thing. Well, I'm much more into intellectual and conceptual research for sure. But I do believe you have at least one interesting account regarding upkeep, maintaining, durability. I think this is a very alternative view for the innovation speak, and I would very much endorse that. So many thanks for your coming here. What I regret most is we don't have a lunch after or a restaurant to go to.
Yeah, we need beer at this point, even though it's only 10:30 in the morning. I would take one. So thank you all for having me. This is a lot of fun, and I hope we can continue the conversation. I think we all know that I put forward a kind of polemical, simplified version of this thing. I think the deep questions will require deep work, and then the question is how to do those case studies. And I hope that's something that we can talk about going forward together in a variety of venues. So thanks so much for having me today.